Sandra is my name. I'm simply an ordinary girl who loves to keep things simple. I work as an editor at one of the major publishing houses downtown. It's always been a juggling act to meet deadlines and find time for yourself. I never really got into the dating scene much, and that's probably why. I like spending time alone by myself, generally with a nice book or a leisurely stroll in the park close to my flat. However, everything changed on a bright Saturday that appeared normal enough. I was walking along carefree, lost in the world of a podcast. The park was bustling with people, their dogs and children playing. It was a lively place. I think I forgot where I was walking because I almost ran into a man on a bicycle the next time I looked up. He screamed, "Watch it," and abruptly veered. He spoke in a gruff tone, making it obvious that he was annoyed. "I'm so sorry." I snapped out of it and took out one earpiece. I was unaware that I had strayed into the cycling path. His expression had changed from anger to amusement as he halted his bike and looked around. "You must pay attention to your direction. Sometimes this journey is like a jungle." "Yes, I apologize. It was entirely my fault," I said, a little ashamed of myself. I smiled shyly at him, brushing a stray lock of hair out of my face. He chuckled, and the tension vanished instantly. "Hello, I'm Tom," he introduced himself. "Sandra." I shook his hand in response. His hold was confident and firm. "So, Sandra, always this distracted, or is it just my charming presence?" I laughed at this sly smile on his face. It was a demanding work week. My mind is already elsewhere, having a great weekend. Attractive enough, he gestured to a tiny cafe at the edge of the park and said, "I was just about to grab a coffee at that place over there. Would you like to come along, as an act of reconciliation for nearly taking me to the stars?" I gave it some thinking. I could really use a coffee, and he seemed like a lovely guy. Yes, of course. I could give you a good story about coffee. Tom was a pleasure to talk to as we strolled to the cafe. He informed me about his weekend activities, which included riding and hanging out with pals, and his work at an automobile sales company. He relocated here since he believed it offered better prospects. He wasn't from the city. Big city dreams and all that, he smirked and replied. I also talked a little bit about my work, how I developed a career out of my love of reading. "Beats being stuck in a cubicle doing something you hate," I continued. When we got to the cafe, we placed our coffee orders. I couldn't help but notice how at ease I felt with him while we waited. It was odd since, generally speaking, I'm a little reticent around strangers, but with Tom, the talk flowed naturally. We began spending more time together after I met Tom. He seemed laid back and amusing, but I soon began to notice small things about him that bothered me. At first, nothing significant, just occasional little remarks that caused me to pause and think. We were going to go out to dinner one Saturday when the subject of careers and family somehow came up. I assumed we were just talking about work and life, nothing serious. "So how's the book world treating you?" Taking a sip of his beer, Tom questioned. "As usual, quite busy. Nobody's deadlines stop for them," I shot back, prodding at my salad. "Yes, I get that, but wouldn't you want to be trapped in that situation forever? You would want to settle down eventually, perhaps reduce the number of hours worked," he remarked breezily. I stopped, froking in place. "Tom, not really. I'm passionate about what I do. I don't think I'll be giving it up very soon, or truly at all." Tom gave a shrug. "Yes, but what about when we become parents? Don't you wish to be in more places?" It surprised me that someone asked. "We?" I laughed apprehensively. "That's jumping way ahead, don't you think?" He dismissed it with a laugh. "Yeah, you're right, just thinking out loud." I made an effort to get rid of the pain, but it persisted. Tom invited me to supper with his folks a few weeks later. I took it as a positive indication that things were becoming more serious. Though anxious, I had hope. However, that evening further broadened my perspective. His parents owned a small, immaculate suburban home. Mrs. Reed, his mother, was beaming when we got there. "Sandra, "It's very nice to meet you at last." She pulled me into an embrace and exclaimed, "Tom has told us so much about you." "Mrs. Reed, thank you for having me. It's nice to meet you as well," I managed to reply, grinning back at her. After dinner was served, everything was going according to plan until Mrs. Reed began discussing marriage and family. "You know, Tom was always the one in charge," she said as she started to eat more potatoes. "We've always told him the importance of finding a good girl who knows her way around the house." Tom's father gave a nod. "Yes, without a doubt. It all comes down to laying a solid foundation. A woman takes care of the home, while a man is required to provide for it." I looked over at Tom, expecting him to comment, but he was too preoccupied with his meal. Mrs. Reed went on, "That's how we brought up our boys. Family comes first. Yes, Tom?" Tom responded, "Right, Mom," finally raising his head. His agreement felt like a punch to the gut. I tried to keep my cool. "It's interesting because I've always been pretty career-oriented. I love my job, and I believe in contributing equally," I said. Mrs. Reed smiled, a bit too sweetly. "Of course, dear, but you'll see. Priorities change when you start having children. It's only natural for a woman to want to stay at home with her babies." The rest of the evening, I felt like I was in a fog. We left shortly after dinner, and on the drive back, the air between us was tense. "Your mom has some strong opinions about family roles," I said, breaking the silence. "Do you see things that way too?" He hesitated, then said, "I think there's some truth to it. I mean, it worked for my parents." Despite the uneasy dinner with Tom's parents, our relationship marched forward. Somehow the good times seemed to outweigh the bad, and I found myself agreeing to marry him. Looking back, love must have blinded me because those warning bells were still ringing in the back of my mind. The wedding planning started, and it was all a whirlwind. Tom wanted something simple, and so did I. We decided on a modest ceremony with just close family and friends. As the day approached, the real pressure began to mount, not about the event, but about what our lives would become afterward. After the ceremony at the reception, Tom's mom pulled me aside. Her smile was wide, but her eyes were serious. "Sandra, dear, I'm so happy for you both. Remember, a good wife supports her husband no matter what." "Thank you, Mrs. Reed. I intend to be a supportive partner," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "And remember, dear, when the babies start coming, it's best if you're at home. You can't trust strangers to raise your children." Her words felt like a warning, and the finality in her tone made my stomach turn. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Later, Tom and I had a moment alone. "Your mom talked to me about kids and me not working." I started, watching his reaction closely. "Yeah, she's just looking out for the future. She means well, Sandra. You know how moms are." Tom brushed it off, taking a sip of his champagne. "But you know I'm not planning to quit my job, right? Even when we have kids," I pressed, needing him to understand. Tom paused, his face serious. "We'll see, Sandra. Things change. We'll do what's best for our family." After our wedding, Tom suggested we move to a larger apartment closer to his work at the car sales company. The place was nice, bigger than our old one, but it was right next door to his parents' house. I had my suspicions about why he chose this particular spot, but I agreed, hoping for the best. Once settled, the reality of our new life together began to surface. Tom started bringing up his idea of a traditional family more often, where he would be the breadwinner and I would handle the household, and eventually the kids. One evening we sat down with our finances spread across the dining table, a mess of bills and budgets under the dim light. I tried to show him how keeping both our jobs was more beneficial, especially with the economy being unstable. "Look at these numbers, Tom. With both incomes, we're not just getting by, we're actually saving. It makes no sense for me to quit my job," I said, pointing at the spreadsheet. Tom shook his head, pushing the papers away slightly. "It's not just about the money, Sandra. It's about having a real family life, like my parents had. I sighed, my frustration growing. But it's not the past, Tom. Things are different now. We both need to contribute. He didn't seem convinced, and the discussion ended with a heavy silence. The situation got more complicated with his mother, Mrs. Reed, living so close. She dropped by often, unannounced, each visit with a new critique about how I was managing our home. One afternoon, I was sorting through some work emails when she came in without a greeting. She started inspecting the house, wiping her finger along the bookshelf, looking for dust. Sandra, you really should focus more on keeping a cleaner house. A dusty home is not a healthy home, she said, her tone sharp. I clenched my teeth, trying to keep my cool. I cleaned yesterday, Mrs. Reed, and I work full-time. It's just a little dust. That's just it. You work too much. If you were home more, maybe things wouldn't slip through, she countered, walking over to the linen closet next. She pulled out a sheet, checking for any signs of improper laundering. I followed her, my hands balled into fists at my sides. I manage my time just fine, Mrs. Reed. Tom and I are both happy with how things are. She tutted, shaking her head as she moved to the kitchen to scrutinize the contents of our fridge. A woman's place is taking care of her home and her husband. These modern ideas about women needing careers are nonsense. Every comment stung, and I felt my defenses rise. Maybe that worked for you, but I'm not you. I won't just quit my job to become someone I'm not. When Tom came home that evening, I tried to explain how suffocating his mother's visits were becoming. He listened, but his response chilled me. Mom's just trying to help, Sandra. She has a lot of experience running a home. But it's our home, not hers. I need you to stand up for me, for us, I pleaded. Tom looked torn, but he finally said, "She's my mom, Sandra. She means well. We should at least consider her advice." The argument that night was long and painful. We went to bed angry, the first of many silent nights. As the days turned into weeks, I felt more like an intruder in my own home, constantly judged and found wanting. The pressure to conform to an outdated idea of a wife was relentless, and my resolve to maintain my independence was tested every day. As the months rolled by, Tom's nagging about me not pulling my weight at home started to increase. He'd come home from work, look around with a scowl, and comment on the dusty shelves or the dinner that was either too bland or overcooked because I'd rushed it after a long day at the publishing house. His favorite refrain became, "If you can't manage both, maybe you shouldn't be working." One evening, after a particularly harsh critique of some slightly undercooked pasta, Tom let it drop. "Sandra, I'm serious. If you can't meet me halfway and take care of the house properly, maybe we should rethink this whole arrangement," he said, implying that a divorce was on the table. I loved Tom despite everything. I didn't want our marriage to fail over something like this, so I made a decision that pained me deeply. The next day, I talked to my boss, Ellen, about quitting my job to become a full-time housewife. Ellen was shocked and tried to persuade me otherwise. "Sandra, you're one of our best. Are you sure about this?" she asked, concern etching her features. "I don't see any other way, Ellen. I have to try to make things work at home," I admitted, feeling defeated. Ellen, ever the problem solver, proposed a compromise. "What if you could work from home, manage your projects remotely? It's becoming more common now. You wouldn't have to quit." The idea seemed like a lifeline. I agreed to the arrangement, but decided not to tell Tom. Instead, I told him I had resigned. He was overjoyed, thinking I had chosen our home life over my career. So I started my new job as a housewife, seeing Tom off to work each morning and greeting him when he came home. But as soon as he left, I'd power up my laptop and dive into my editing work. It was a strange double life, but it worked. The money I earned from my remote job I secretly saved in a separate bank account, just in case. However, living on just Tom's salary was tougher than we thought. Despite my best efforts to economize, 3 months later, we were scraping the bottom of the barrel. I tried to bring up the topic gently. "Tom, I think it might be necessary for me to go back to work. We're running through our savings too fast." Tom's reaction was swift and angry. "That's because you're spending too much. You need to learn how to save properly," he snapped. I was stunned. I hadn't bought anything for myself in months and always hunted for the cheapest deals at the supermarket. His words hurt deeply, and I felt a mix of anger and humiliation. The next day, his mother came over with a mission to teach me proper budgeting. She dragged me to the store and pointed out the cheapest, often poorest quality products. "Buy these, Sandra. Stop wasting money on expensive stuff," she lectured as we walked down the aisles. Back home, she showed me how to dilute dish soap to make it last longer. "You use too much. You need to make do with less," she instructed, her tone patronizing. She even started checking my receipts, scolding me for any purchase she deemed unnecessary. "Why are you buying this? Just stick to basics," she would say, shaking her head in disapproval. Living like this was unbearable. Every day felt more suffocating than the last. I was losing my sense of self to their imposed austerity, living under constant surveillance. The situation was becoming untenable. I was trapped in a life of pretended submission, and every part of me screamed for escape. But for now I held on, biding my time and planning my next steps carefully. It all reached a boiling point one drizzly Tuesday evening. I was on the phone in the living room, pouring my heart out to my mom. "I just don't know how much more I can take, Mom. His mother is constantly over here teaching me how to stretch $1 until it screams. I get it, we need to save, but this is too much." Mom's voice was a mix of concern and anger. "Sandra, that's not normal. You need to have a conversation with Tom about boundaries. It's your home too, not just his or his mother's playground." Just as I was nodding, feeling a bit strengthened by my mom's support, Tom stormed in from the other room, his face red with anger. He must have heard me complaining. He snatched the phone right out of my hand. A wife shouldn't be complaining about her husband and mother-in-law like some street gossip. He snapped into the phone before hanging up. I was shocked, my hand shaking a bit. "Tom, you can't just grab my phone and talk to my mom that way." "Oh, I can't. Maybe if you had some respect for us, I wouldn't have to." His voice was rising, and I could see the veins in his neck bulging. "Tom, listen to yourself. Can't you see this isn't healthy?" I pleaded, hoping to reach some part of him that remembered what love felt like, but he was beyond reason. "Healthy? My mom was right. I should never have married you." His words cut deeper than I would have expected. "That's enough, Tom. I'm your wife, not some puppet you and your mom can control." I shot back, my own anger flaring up now. "Then act like it or leave," he shouted, his face just inches from mine. I stared at him, disbelief and sadness warring inside me. "You want me to leave at 4 o'clock a.m.? It's dark and pouring rain outside. If you don't like how things are, then yes, get out." His eyes were cold, unyielding. I knew then that nothing I could say would change his mind or the situation. Shaking, I grabbed a few essentials, my laptop, some clothes, and my phone. I went for my purse next, but Tom was quicker. He grabbed it first, holding it out of my reach. "You think you're leaving with this? I earned this money, not you." "Fine, keep it," I said, my voice hollow. I couldn't believe this was happening. I called a taxi and waited by the door, my heart pounding. The taxi pulled up, and I stepped out into the cold night air, the rain drenching me immediately. As I climbed into the car, a sense of surreal calm settled over me. I was doing this. I was leaving. At the hotel, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, I couldn't help but feel a surge of relief amidst the turmoil. Despite everything, I hadn't quit my job. My secret savings account, unknown to Tom, was now my lifeline. The first light of dawn was barely peeking through the curtains when I got up. I hadn't slept much, the weight of my decision pressing down on me through the night. Today was the day I would take control back. I had an appointment with a lawyer to talk about filing for divorce. It felt surreal, like a scene from someone else's life, not mine. The lawyer's office was a stark, unassuming place tucked between a row of old brick buildings. Inside, Mr. Henderson, my lawyer, was a straight-talking man who wasted no time. "Let's get down to business," he said as soon as I sat down. "You're here to file for divorce, correct?" "Yes," I confirmed, my voice steadier than I expected. "I can't go back to the way things were." Mr. Henderson nodded, his face serious. "All right, I'll need all the details. Any joint accounts, property, anything that needs untangling." We spent the next hour going over everything. He explained the legal process, what I could expect, and what my rights were. He was thorough, ensuring I understood every step before drawing up the necessary documents. "You'll need to serve these to your husband," he instructed as he handed me the envelope, sealed with a stamp that felt like the seal on my old life. Armed with the divorce papers, I went back to the apartment I had shared with Tom. He was still asleep, probably exhausted from last night's fallout. The apartment felt different as I packed my things. Every item I tucked away marked the end of another shared chapter. By the time I finished packing, Tom was stirring. He wandered into the kitchen, bleary-eyed and clearly confused to see my bags piled by the door. "What's going on?" he mumbled, scratching his head. I didn't have much to say, just actions to take. Instead of answering, I handed him the envelope. "These are for you," I said, my voice void of the emotion I felt turning inside. Tom tore open the envelope, a frown forming as he scanned the contents. "Divorce." He laughed, disbelief lacing his tone. "You think you can just walk out and everything will be all right." He looked up from the papers, his eyes cold. "Come back when you're ready to apologize, and maybe I'll consider taking you back. But remember, you'll have to listen to my mother from now on." The absurdity of his words almost made me laugh, but I held it back. "I'm not coming back, Tom. I'm done. We're done." Walking out of that apartment, the air felt different, crisper, almost hopeful. I went straight to a new place I had rented days before, small but mine alone, a place where I could start rebuilding. Each step felt heavy but right. I returned to the office a few weeks after moving in and immediately became engrossed in the hectic schedule of author meetings and publishing deadlines. I had feared I had lost my spark, but being among my coworkers once more and experiencing the usual rush of a deadline drawing near rekindled it. Weeks at work slipped into days, and before long, I was back to my usual schedule, using my recent personal upheavals as fuel to juggle projects and deadlines with renewed efficiency. Coming back felt incredibly fantastic. Surprisingly, the familiar terrain of errors and texts felt even more comfy. I made new acquaintances during this period, folks I had known long before Tom. We got together for meals on the weekends and after work, and I gradually began to feel more like myself than I had in a long time. I felt grounded by their jokes and laughing, and I rediscovering aspects of myself that I had forgotten in their presence. After a few months of this new chapter in my life, I received an unexpected call. It was Tom, his voice unnatural, full of a desperation I was not ready for. "Hey, I guess I got fired. Things are quite difficult," he began, fumbling over his words. "I was thinking maybe you could help me out financially." The request seemed outlandish and, considering our past, a little offensive. "And perhaps we should start afresh. Reassemble. Please be more serious if you're going to apologize to my mother and me." His tone waned, hesitant but optimistic. It was unavoidable for me. I dissolved into giggles. After all, the proposal's sheer ridiculousness was too much. "After you kicked me out, Tom, do you really believe I would return back to help you and your parents? All of your lofty ideals seem to have vanished out of thin air when you lost your job." The phone rang for a moment. "So that's a no," he said, sounding diminished in some way. "I'm doing pretty well, Tom. To be honest, I'm too happy with my independence to give it up any time soon. I wish you well, but it's not going to happen with me." My harsh remarks were the last straw that would break our relationship. I had a wave of empowerment after hanging up. Even though Tom's call seemed absurd, it confirmed for me something very important. No amount of money or persuasion could ever take away my true freedom.